Hey, welcome back. If you're new here, pull up your blanket, get comfortable, and find your best spot on the pillow. You're exactly where you need to be tonight. Okay, I want to ask you something before we begin. What if I told you that one of the most well-known facts you learned in school, something your history teacher probably said with complete confidence, is wrong? Not a little wrong. Not well, it depends on context wrong. I mean, flat out, statistically backwards, we all got fooled wrong. And this particular myth, it is about something that touches every single one of us, how long we live, and specifically how long people lived in medieval Europe. Before we go any further down this rabbit hole tonight, I just want to say if this story makes you curious or surprised, or just gives you that warm feeling of learning something you genuinely did not know before, please take a second and hit that like button. Leave a comment or subscribe to the channel. It really does matter more than you know. And hey, I am genuinely curious about you. Where are you right now? In bed? On the couch? Is it 2 a.m. and you absolutely should be asleep? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Alright, dim the lights if you can. Maybe turn on a fan for some soft background noise. Let the world outside get a little quieter, and let us begin. So, the myth. You've probably heard it. Maybe a teacher said it in middle school, maybe you read it in a textbook, or maybe you just absorbed it somewhere along the way we absorb all those half-true things that live quietly in the back of our minds. In the Middle Ages, the average life expectancy was only 35 years, so a 40-year-old was basically ancient. It sounds dramatic. It makes the Middle Ages feel distant, dark, almost like a different species of human experience. Like people back then were just rushing through life because the clock was ticking so fast. There is just one problem. It is not true. Well, let me be careful here because I want to be accurate. The number 35. That part is technically correct depending on the source and time period. But what people think that number means, that is where everyone got completely turned around. Including, if I'm being honest, me for a very long time. Here's what actually happened. Picture a medieval village in England somewhere around the year 1200. In a small stone cottage, a baby is born. Let us call him Thomas. He is healthy, he has a strong cry, and his mother is exhausted but proud. But here is the brutal truth of that world. Thomas has roughly a 30% chance of not surviving his first year. 30%. That is not a small number. That is nearly 1 in 3 babies not making it to their first birthday. And if Thomas does survive that, he still has to navigate the next several years of childhood measles, dysentery, smallpox diseases that swept through medieval villages the way wildfire moves through dry grass. No vaccines, no antibiotics, no understanding of germ theory, just prayer and luck and the strength of a small body fighting things it has never encountered before. Now imagine we track every person born in that village from the moment they enter the world. Some die at 6 months, some at 3 years old. A young man dies in a farming accident at 19. A woman dies in childbirth at 23. A soldier does not come home from battle at 26. We add up all their ages at death. We divide by the number of people, and we get our average, around 35. But right here is the part the textbook forgot to mention. Thomas survived. Our boy made it through. He scraped past every single one of those dangers, and now he is 25 years old, standing in a field with calloused hands and muddy boots and a whole life ahead of him. And here is the thing, his expected lifespan has now completely changed. According to research on medieval England, specifically studying landowners and their records, a man who survived to his 25th birthday could expect, on average, to live until he was around 50. And that is just the average. Many people in that group lived well into their 60s and 70s. Some, as we are about to find out, lived into their 90s and were still running entire fleets of warships. The 35-year figure is not wrong. It is just a story about babies, not about the lives of adults who made it through. Medievalist Dr. Eleanor Janega, who has spent her career correcting exactly this myth, has said, and I am paraphrasing because she was quite passionate about it, that the idea people were considered old in their early 30s is extremely not true. Not a little off. Extremely not true. And here is the part that genuinely stopped me in my tracks the first time I read it. Medieval people themselves did not think 40-year-olds were old. They had an entire philosophical system for thinking about the stages of life. Scholars of the time divided human existence into distinct phases. You were a young adult from roughly 21 to 40. Then came what they called maturus, the mature years from roughly 40 to 60. And only after 60 did you enter what they actually called senectus, old age. A 45-year-old in medieval thinking was not old. They were seasoned, experienced, maybe a little grey around the temples and a little stiffer in the knees, but not done. Sound familiar? Because honestly, that sounds almost exactly like how most of us think about it today. Now I know what some of you might be thinking. Okay, but surely people looked and felt older faster. The hard work, the bad food, the cold winters with no central heating. And yes, you're not wrong. A medieval 50-year-old probably had more wrinkles, fewer teeth, and a spine with very strong opinions about rainy weather. We will absolutely get into all of that, and I promise you it is both fascinating and slightly horrifying. But first I need to introduce you to someone. His name was Enrico Dandolo. He was the Doge of Venice. Think of him as the elected ruler, the most powerful man in the most powerful merchant city in all of Europe. And in the year 1199, at what historians estimate was approximately 90 years old, he stood up in front of a cathedral full of people and volunteered personally to lead the Fourth Crusade. 90 years old. He was nearly blind by that point. He could barely make out the faces of the crowd cheering in front of him. And yet, by all historical accounts, the crowd went absolutely wild. Because here was this ancient, nearly blind, unmistakably old man standing up and saying, "I will go, I will lead." And he did. He commanded the Venetian fleet. He helped coordinate one of the most significant and, yes, most controversial military operations of the medieval era. He helped lead the capture of Constantinople in 1204, at 91 years old. Now, whether you admire what he did or not is a whole other conversation for a whole other night. But the fact remains, a 91-year-old man was commanding a naval invasion, not sitting in a chair being carried, commanding. So the next time someone tells you medieval people were old at 40, you now have a name. And Dandolo was not alone. Edward I of England was leading military campaigns into his late 60s. The poet Geoffrey Chaucer wrote some of his most celebrated work in his 50s. The abbess Hildegard of Bingen was composing visionary music and writing scientific treatises well into her 80s. These were not rare exceptions who somehow survived in spite of their world. They were products of a world where if you made it through the dangerous gauntlet of childhood, you could absolutely live a long, full, complicated life. The real tragedy of the Middle Ages was not that everyone died young. The tragedy was that so many never got the chance to grow old at all, because childhood was where the real danger lived. And once you understand that one distinction, once you let that single mathematical truth land, everything shifts. The people of the Middle Ages stop feeling like shadows. They start feeling like us. Grandparents with grandchildren on their knees, elders who remember the great flood of 40 years ago, old men grumbling about how young people do not work as hard as they used to, completely recognizably human. So now the real question opens up in front of us. If medieval people did grow old, and we now know beyond doubt that they absolutely did, what was that experience actually like? What happened to your body when the years piled on and there was no doctor who could really help? How did your community treat you with reverence, with tenderness, or with something far more complicated? Was there any version of retirement in a world where stopping work often meant stopping eating? And what did it feel like in your bones, in your chest, in your soul to be old in a world with no pain relief, no eyeglasses, and no safety net waiting to catch you? Because the truth is so much more layered, so much more human, and honestly so much more surprising than anything the textbooks gave us. And to understand it fully, we need to start at the very beginning. We need to understand the map not of land but of a medieval life itself. How did people of that time actually divide up a human lifespan? When did they think youth ended and age began? And what does a word like old actually mean when the world looks completely different from anything we have ever known? That is exactly where we are going next. There is something I find endlessly fascinating about the way different cultures draw lines around time. We do it today, right? 30 is the new 20, 40 is the new 30. 50 is when life really begins, apparently, if you believe enough birthday cards. We're always negotiating with the numbers, always trying to move the goalpost just a little bit further down the field. But here is what I want to know tonight. What happened when you lived in a world without birthday cards, without mirrors on every wall, without a driver's license in your pocket, reminding you in cold, hard numbers exactly how many years you had accumulated? How did medieval people actually think about the map of a human life? And more specifically, when did they look at someone and think that person is old? The answer is genuinely surprising, and it tells us something not just about the Middle Ages, but about the very human need to make sense of time passing. Let me paint you a picture. It is sometime around the year 1250. You're walking through a monastery in northern France. The walls are cool stone, the air smells faintly of candle wax and old parchment, and on the wall in front of you is a painting. Not a painting of a battle or a king or a saint performing a miracle. It is a wheel, a great circular wheel turning, and on it at different positions are human figures at different stages of life. A baby at the bottom, a boy climbing upward, a young man at the peak, proud and upright. Then the slow descent, a middle-aged man, then an older one, then a figure bent with age sliding back toward the bottom. This was called the Wheel of Fortune, or sometimes the Wheel of Life. And it was everywhere in medieval Europe. On church walls, in illuminated manuscripts carved into cathedral doorways. It was in a very real sense the medieval world's diagram for human existence. What strikes me every time I look at one of these images is how honest they are. There is no pretending the wheel does not turn. There is no 60 as the new 40 cheerfulness. The wheel goes up, the wheel comes down. That is just how it works. But here is where it gets philosophically interesting, and I promise I will not make this too academic, because the real stories are far more fun. Medieval scholars were absolutely obsessed with categorizing the stages of life. And I mean obsessed in the way that only people with a lot of candle hours and no Netflix can truly be obsessed. Different thinkers came up with different systems. Some divided life into 3 stages, some into 4, some into 7, which is very medieval of them. 7 was the magic number for almost everything. 7 deadly sins, 7 sacraments, 7 days of creation. Of course, there had to be 7 ages of man. One of the most influential frameworks came from Isidore of Seville, a bishop and scholar from the 7th century, who basically tried to write down everything humanity had ever learned. His life stages went something like this: infantia, infancy, up to about age 7, then pueritia, childhood, up to 14, then adolescentia, which in his system stretched all the way to 28, then juventus, youth, and young adulthood running until about 50, and only after 50 did you enter senectus, old age, followed eventually by senium, which was the final, most frail stage of life. Now pause on that for a second. In Isidore's framework, which was enormously influential across medieval Europe for centuries, a 30-year-old was not old, not even close. They were not even done with Juventus. They were solidly in the middle of what he considered the prime of life. And Isidore was not alone. The philosopher and poet Dante Alighieri, yes, the man who wrote the Divine Comedy, the most famous poem of the medieval world, also wrote about the stages of life in a lesser-known work called the Convivio. And in it he compared the peak of human life to the arc of the sun across the sky. He placed that peak at around age 35, not as the end of life, as the height of it, the noon, the moment before the sun begins its long, beautiful, unhurried descent toward evening. I love that image, honestly. There is something almost tender about it. Dante was not afraid of aging, he just wanted to understand the shape of it. But let me bring this closer to the ground, because what happened in real life in the fields and markets and courtrooms of medieval Europe was sometimes quite different from what philosophers wrote in warm, candlelit studies. Here's a genuinely fascinating detail that most people have never heard about. In medieval England, there was a legal concept that sounds almost absurdly modern when you first encounter it. If someone was making a claim about land boundaries, about where one field ended and another began, and there were no written documents to prove it, the court would call in what were known as ancient men, elderly witnesses who could testify from memory about how things had been 40, 50, 60 years ago. The older you were, the more your memory was worth in a court of law. Let that land for a moment. Your age was literally a legal qualification. You were not just tolerated because you were old. You were required because you were old. We will come back to this idea in much more depth later tonight because it opens up something profound about the role of elderly people in a world without written records. But for now, I just want to let it sit there, the image of an 80-year-old farmer called into a medieval courtroom whose wrinkled memory was the most important evidence in the entire case. Now, back to our map. If there was one thing medieval society agreed on across all the different philosophical frameworks, it was this: the transition into what we would genuinely call old age happened somewhere around 60. Not 40, not 50. 60, and I think it is worth pausing on that because it contradicts so completely what most of us were taught. A person in their 40s in medieval Europe was generally considered to be in their mature years, experienced, capable, still very much expected to work and lead and contribute. Philippe de Nevers, a 13th century French-Italian writer who composed one of the most charming guides to aging I have ever come across, described the 40s and 50s as a time of wisdom and authority. He wrote that older people who had lived well deserved respect, and that a community which ignored its elders was a community walking blindly into trouble. He was not wrong. But here is the tension that I find genuinely interesting, the thing that makes this more than just a history lesson. Medieval society had this philosophical and religious ideal of respecting elders. It was written into church teachings. It was embedded in the philosophy, honor your father and your mother. Listen to the wisdom of the aged. And yet, there is a wonderful, slightly uncomfortable piece of evidence from the medieval period that suggests reality did not always match the ideal. In some medieval German communities, there was an old folk custom, thankfully largely symbolic by the Middle Ages, and historians debate how literally it was ever practiced, called Altentail. It referred to the arrangement where an aging farmer would hand over his land and farm to his adult children, and in return they were supposed to care for him in his old age. The key word there is supposed to, because there are court records, actual medieval court records of elderly parents taking their adult children to legal proceedings because the children had taken the land, and then quietly stopped providing the food and firewood and warm clothes they had promised. Does that sound familiar? Does that sound like a problem that belongs exclusively to the distant past? It does not. And that is the thing about medieval history that never stops catching me off guard. The details change, the clothes, the language, the religion, the technology, all different, but certain human problems. They are remarkably, almost uncomfortably consistent across the centuries. Adult children inheriting things before they are quite ready to be grateful. Elderly parents wondering if they made the right arrangements. The quiet negotiations of power within a family as one generation hands the torch to the next. This was happening in Bavaria in the year 1280. It is happening somewhere today. Different names, same story. Now I want to ask you something, and this is a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. When do you think old age begins? Not what society tells you. Not what the birthday card industry has decided. What do you actually feel somewhere in your gut is the line? Because I think, if you're honest with yourself, your answer probably has less to do with a specific number and more to do with a feeling of slowing down, of the world moving slightly faster than you expected, of looking in the mirror and recognizing someone familiar but different. Medieval people felt that too. The philosopher Roger Bacon, and not the more famous Francis Bacon, but a different earlier Bacon, a 13th century friar who was absolutely wild by medieval standards, wrote that aging was not inevitable in the way most people assumed. He believed it could be slowed, managed, that the right habits, the right foods, the right way of living could extend a person's vital years considerably. He was trying in his own medieval way to hack aging. He is essentially the world's first biohacker, and I find him completely delightful. But more importantly, he was paying attention to something real. The pace at which a person aged in medieval Europe was not fixed. It was not the same for everyone. A monk in a well-provisioned monastery in southern England aged very differently from a tin miner in Cornwall. A wealthy widow in Florence aged very differently from a peasant woman in rural Burgundy. The map of a medieval life was not one map. It was dozens of maps layered on top of each other, shaped by your gender, your wealth, your location, your luck, and the particular cruelty or kindness of the world you happened to be born into. And of all the things that made medieval aging different from one person to the next one, stands above everything else, in terms of sheer visceral impact, your body. Because philosophy and court records and clever monks writing about life stages, all of that is fascinating, but none of it tells you what it actually felt like in your bones and joints and eyes and teeth to grow old in a world without any of the things we take completely for granted. No pain relief, no eyeglasses, no dentist with a gentle hand and a numbing injection. Just your body and time. And what time did to those medieval bodies is a story that is simultaneously difficult to hear and impossible to look away from. Close your eyes for just a second, just 1 second, and imagine this. You wake up. It is dark outside the way only pre-dawn darkness can be dark when there are no street lights, no glow from a phone screen, no ambient light from a city humming somewhere nearby. Just black. Cold black, and the first thing you feel before you are even fully awake is your hands, your knuckles, swollen overnight, stiff and hot the way they always are in the cold months now. You try to curl your fingers around the edge of your wool blanket, and it takes a moment, a long determined moment. You breathe through it. This is just how mornings are now. You sit up. Your back voices its displeasure. Not loudly, it stopped shouting years ago, but it is there. A low, persistent commentary that never quite goes quiet. You're 53 years old. You're a blacksmith in medieval England, and your body is telling you in the only language it knows exactly what 53 years of living in this world costs. This is part 3, and I want to be honest with you, this one is going to be a little harder to sit with. Not because the history is dramatic or violent, but because it is so close, so recognizable. The details are different from our world, yes, but the feeling underneath them, that is ancient and entirely familiar. Let us talk about what really happened to the medieval body as it aged. Archaeologists have a gift that historians sometimes do not. They can read the truth directly from bone. When researchers excavate medieval cemeteries, and many hundreds have been studied across England, France, Germany and Italy, they find something remarkably consistent. Skeletal remains that belong to people who lived past the age of 40 almost universally show evidence of one particular condition, osteoarthritis, not occasionally, not in some cases, almost universally. The joints most commonly affected the spine, the hips, the knees, the hands, precisely the parts of a human body that a medieval labourer, a medieval farmer, a medieval craftsperson used every single day of their lives in ways that modern ergonomics and labour laws were specifically designed to prevent. Here is what I find quietly devastating about this evidence. When a modern bioarchaeologist, someone who studies ancient human remains, examines a medieval skeleton and tries to estimate the person's age, at death, one of their primary tools is the degree of wear on the joints. The worse the arthritis, the older the individual is likely to have been. Pain was not a symptom of aging in the medieval world. Pain was aging. They were essentially the same thing. Now you might be thinking, well, we have arthritis today too. People in their 50s and 60s deal with joint pain all the time, and that is absolutely true. But here is the crucial difference. Today you have options. You have anti-inflammatory medications. You have physical therapy. You have joint replacement surgery, a genuinely miraculous intervention that gives people their mobility back. You have heating pads, ergonomic furniture, hot showers, and the ability to decide that today you are going to rest because your hip is particularly bad. A medieval blacksmith had none of that. A medieval farmer had none of that. They had willow bark tea, which actually does contain a compound related to aspirin, and it genuinely helped, but it was not aspirin, and the work still had to be done because if the work did not get done, the family did not eat. There is a document I keep coming back to when I think about this. It is from an anonymous 11th century monk. We do not know his name. We just have his words, which feel somehow appropriate, and he wrote in Latin a lament about his own aging body. Scholars have translated and discussed it across multiple academic works on medieval old age. He wrote something along these lines. Now old age drags me subdued to my end. My vision is fading. My headache is increasing. My teeth are falling out. My limbs are trembling. My powers are completely diminishing. That is not poetry. That is a list. A medical inventory written by a man paying very close attention to what was happening inside him with no clinical language to wrap around it, just the plain, startling facts of his experience. Teeth falling out. Let us stay there for a moment because I think it deserves more than a passing mention. Dental disease in the medieval period was not just painful, it was dangerous. An untreated tooth abscess, which happens when bacteria from a decayed tooth infects the surrounding tissue, can spread into the jawbone, into the neck, into the bloodstream. In a world without antibiotics, a bad tooth could genuinely end your life, and medieval people knew this. They feared it. They tried everything they could think of to prevent it. Here is a genuinely surprising piece of medieval dental history. A document called the Leech Book of Bald, and yes, that is its actual name, and yes, I appreciate it every time, is an Anglo-Saxon medical text from around the 9th century, and it contains detailed remedies for toothache. Some involved rubbing the tooth with specific herbs, some involved prayers, one memorably involved holding a candle close to the aching tooth, and then spitting the resulting material into a bowl of cold water, based on the theory that you could draw the toothworms out with heat. The toothworm theory was wrong, obviously, but the impulse behind it, the desperate human desire to make the pain stop, is something every single one of us understands. By the time a medieval person reached their late 50s or 60s, if they still had most of their teeth, they were genuinely fortunate. Archaeological evidence from medieval London burial sites shows that a significant proportion of adults showed severe dental wear and decay by middle age. Some had lost nearly all their teeth, and eating soft food, which is what you defaulted to when chewing became too painful, meant a softer, less nutritious diet, which meant the body had fewer resources to fight everything else. It was a cascade. Each problem made the next one worse. Then there was vision. Can I tell you what strikes me as one of the most quietly profound technological inventions in all of human history? Eyeglasses. They were invented in northern Italy, almost certainly in the city of Florence or Pisa, sometime around the year 1280 to 1300. This was genuinely revolutionary, not in the dramatic, world-shaking sense we usually reserve for the word revolutionary, but in the deeply personal, quietly life-altering sense. Because before eyeglasses existed, a person whose vision began to fail in their 40s or 50s had essentially one option: squint more. That was it. Squint and move things closer to your face and accept that the world was becoming a blur. For most people, this meant a gradual withdrawal from any work that required fine detail. A scribe who could no longer read his own handwriting. A needlewoman who could no longer thread her needle. A merchant who could no longer read his own ledgers without pressing them against his nose. And here is what I find genuinely moving about the invention of eyeglasses. The very first people to benefit from them were not kings or soldiers. They were monks and scholars. People whose entire life was built around the ability to read. People for whom failing eyesight was not just an inconvenience, it was the end of everything they had dedicated themselves to. There is a sermon given by a Dominican friar named Giordano da Pisa in the year 1306, just a few years after spectacles became more widely available, in which he mentioned them almost in passing. He said something to the effect that spectacles had been invented not 20 years ago, and that they were one of the best and most necessary of all the arts in the world. Not 20 years ago. He was describing something brand new, something that was in his lifetime changing what it meant to grow old. But remember, this was 1306, and eyeglasses were expensive. They were hand-ground by craftsmen. They were available in towns, not in rural villages. So for the vast majority of medieval people, the farmers, the shepherds, the rural labourers, who made up perhaps 80 or 90% of the population failing vision, remained exactly what it had always been: the gradual dimming of the world. I want to ask you something now, and I mean it genuinely. Have you ever watched someone you love get older and struggle with their body? Have you ever sat with a grandparent who could not quite grip a cup the way they used to, or a parent who moved more carefully on stairs than they once did? That feeling, that particular mixture of love and grief and helplessness, that feeling was not invented by modernity. Every generation that has ever lived has felt it. Medieval children watched their parents slow down. Medieval grandchildren helped their grandparents across uneven ground. The specifics of the decline were different. The emotional weight of witnessing it was identical. And in many ways, the medieval response to physical decline was more communal, more integrated into daily life than what many of us experience today. Old age was not hidden. It was not a private embarrassment. It happened in the shared spaces of family and community, visible and acknowledged. But that communal visibility had its own complications and its own cruelties, because in a world where your value was closely tied to what you could produce, what happened when your body simply could not produce anymore? What happened when the blacksmith's hands finally could not grip the hammer? When the farmer's back would not let him bend to tend the crops? When the woman who had managed a household for 40 years could no longer climb the stairs? Medieval medicine had some answers to these questions. Not the answers we would recognize, not the answers that actually worked most of the time, but answers rooted in a theory of the human body that was coherent, internally logical, and deeply fascinatingly wrong in ways that are almost poetic when you look at them closely. Because the physicians of the medieval world had a complete explanation for why bodies aged. They had a framework for understanding every ache, every tremor, every cold limb and clouded eye. They had 4 humours, and the story of how these 4 humours shaped the experience of growing old, including some of the strangest medical advice ever put to parchment, is a story I cannot wait to tell you. 4 humours. If you've ever heard that phrase and moved past it quickly the way we tend to move past things that sound old and irrelevant, I want to gently ask you to slow down. Because the theory of the 4 humours is not just a quirky historical footnote. It was the lens through which an entire civilization understood the human body for more than 1,000 years. It shaped what medieval doctors prescribed, what medieval patients expected, and critically for our story tonight, how the experience of growing old was understood, explained, and treated across every corner of medieval Europe. And some of it, when you look closely, is stranger than fiction. Some of it is surprisingly wise, and some of it is the kind of thing that makes you profoundly, deeply grateful for modern medicine. Let us walk through it together. The theory of the 4 humours did not begin in the Middle Ages. It came from ancient Greece, from Hippocrates and later Galen, and it was so compelling, so internally consistent, so elegantly organised, that it survived essentially unchanged for roughly 1,400 years. The basic idea was this: the human body contained 4 fundamental fluids or humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Each humour was associated with specific qualities: hot, cold, wet, dry, and with specific seasons, specific organs, specific temperaments. When these 4 humours were in balance, you were healthy. When they fell out of balance, you became ill. Simple, clean, logical. And for aging specifically, the theory had a very particular explanation. Life according to humoral medicine was essentially a slow process of drying out. An infant's body was wet and warm, full of vital moisture, brimming with the heat of life. As you aged, you gradually lost that moisture. Your natural heat diminished. The body became progressively drier, cooler, less vital. Old age was the body's moisture nearly depleted, its warmth almost extinguished. And death was the final cooling the flame, going out entirely when the last of the fuel was consumed. Now, is that scientifically accurate? No. But is it a coherent way of making sense of what you can observe? Actually, yes. An elderly person does tend to have drier skin, less body heat, slower circulation. The medieval physicians were describing real phenomena. They were just wrong about the underlying mechanism, and their treatments flowed directly from their theory. If old age was characterized by cold and dryness, then the remedy was warmth and moisture, which meant, and I want you to appreciate just how logically consistent this is, even as I tell you some of the specifics, that the medical advice for elderly people in the Middle Ages was, broadly speaking, stay warm, eat moist foods, drink good wine, and take frequent baths. I genuinely cannot tell if that sounds like a medical prescription or a weekend in Tuscany, but wait, it gets better. Let me introduce you to someone whose name deserves to be far more famous in Western culture than it currently is: Ibn Sina, known in the Latin West as Avicenna. A Persian physician, philosopher, and all-around intellectual force of nature, who lived from approximately 980 to 1037, and who wrote one of the most influential medical texts in human history, the Canon of Medicine. This was not a small pamphlet. This was a 5-volume encyclopedia of medical knowledge, systematic, detailed, extraordinarily ambitious, that was used as a standard medical textbook in European universities for centuries. Well into the 16th century and beyond, medical students across France, Italy, and England were studying Avicenna's framework, and Avicenna dedicated a significant portion of his work specifically to the care of elderly people. Here is what fascinates me about that. In a world where old age was often dismissed as simply the natural decay of the body, nothing to be done, just wait for death, Avicenna approached it as a medical challenge, something to be understood, something to be managed, something that with the right knowledge and the right habits could be made significantly more comfortable. He wrote about the importance of diet for elderly people with remarkable specificity. Easily digestible foods, soft meats, gentle soups, warm broths. He warned against heavy, difficult-to-digest meals that would tax a weakened stomach. He wrote about the timing of meals, about how older people should eat smaller amounts more frequently, rather than large meals that overwhelm their diminished digestive capacity. He wrote about exercise. Specifically, he recommended moderate, gentle movement for the elderly, walking light activity, nothing strenuous enough to exhaust a body that no longer had the reserves to recover quickly, but nothing so sedentary that the body stiffened entirely. He wrote about sleep, how the elderly needed more rest but should not be completely inactive, because too much lying still was itself a kind of harm. He wrote about emotional well-being, about the importance of pleasant company, of avoiding excessive grief or anger, of finding joy where possible, because in his understanding of the body, strong negative emotions caused real physical harm. They disrupted the humours, disturbed the balance, accelerated decline. And honestly, strip away the humoral framework. Look at the practical recommendations themselves. Some of them are not wrong. Some of them align remarkably well with what modern geriatric medicine recommends for elderly patients today. Gentle exercise, easily digestible, nutrition, social engagement, emotional support, adequate sleep. Avicenna was working with an incorrect model of the body, but he was paying very careful attention to actual human beings, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes careful attention compensates for theoretical error in ways that matter. Now, I want to be fair and honest here, because the history of medieval medicine is not all Avicenna and warm baths. Some of it is genuinely alarming. Bloodletting, for instance. The practice of deliberately removing blood from a patient through cuts or through the use of leeches was one of the most common medical interventions of the medieval period, and it was used for almost everything. Fever, bleed the patient. Headache, bleed the patient. Swelling in the joints, bleed the patient. Depression, bleed the patient. The logic again was humoral. If a patient was suffering from an excess of one humour, you removed some of that humour. Blood was the humour most visibly removable, so blood was what tended to come out. For young, otherwise healthy patients, this was often simply uncomfortable and unhelpful. For elderly patients who were already weakened, already potentially anemic, already struggling with circulation, it could be genuinely dangerous. Removing blood from someone who did not have enough reserves to replace it was not treatment. It was the opposite of treatment, and yet the physicians of the medieval world believed in it completely. Not because they were cruel or stupid, they absolutely were not, but because the logic was airtight within their framework. The theory said excess humours caused illness. Bloodletting removed excess humours, therefore bloodletting treated illness. The chain of reasoning was perfect. It was only the premises that were wrong. Here is what I find genuinely interesting about this from a philosophical perspective, and you can tell me if I am going too deep here, but I think it is worth sitting with. The medieval physicians had enormous confidence in their system. They had Avicenna, they had Galen, they had centuries of accumulated tradition, all internally consistent. And within that tradition their treatments made complete sense, which raises a question that I think about more than is probably healthy. What are the things we are completely confident about today, the treatments, the frameworks, the ways of understanding human health, that future generations will look back on with the same mixture of admiration and gentle horror that we bring to medieval bloodletting? I genuinely do not know. but I suspect the answer is more than we realize. Let me bring you into a specific moment, a real one documented in medieval sources. Somewhere in France in the early 14th century there is a physician attending to an elderly nobleman. The nobleman is in his late 60s, which in the medieval understanding of things makes him genuinely old in the senectus category, the stage of life where decline was expected and managed rather than reversed. He has pain in his joints. He is sleeping poorly. His digestion is troubled. His hands tremble. The physician's approach would have followed a structured protocol rooted in humoral theory and in the practical wisdom accumulated over generations of medical training. He would have assessed the patient's complexion, literally the colour and texture of skin, to determine which humour was dominant. He would have examined urine, which was one of the primary diagnostic tools of medieval medicine. The colour, clarity, consistency, and even the smell of urine were all considered informative. There were elaborate charts called uroscopy wheels showing what different urine characteristics indicated. He would have asked about diet, sleep, emotional state, recent activities, the weather. He would have checked the pulse not with the scientific precision of modern cardiology, but with a trained sensitivity to rhythm and quality that had its own subtle language. And then he would have made his recommendations. Probably adjust the diet toward warming, moistening foods. Wine, good wine, not sour wine, which was considered harmful in moderate quantities. Warm baths to restore moisture to the drying body. Gentle walking in mild weather. Avoidance of strong emotions. Rest. And possibly, depending on his specific diagnosis, a gentle course of bloodletting carefully calibrated to the patient's reduced capacity, because even the most enthusiastic bloodletting physician knew that an elderly patient could not tolerate what a young soldier could. Was this helpful? Some of it, yes. The dietary advice, the warm baths, the moderate exercise, the emotional counsel, these things genuinely contributed to comfort and well-being. The uroscopy was useless diagnostically, though the practice of paying close attention to bodily signs was not. And the bloodletting was depending on the specific situation somewhere between harmless and actively harmful. Medieval medicine for the elderly was a mixture of genuine insight, careful observation, and theoretical error held together by a framework that was internally coherent but externally wrong. Which, when you think about it, might be a fair description of every medical system in history, including our own, just at different ratios. There is one more figure I want to introduce you to before we move on, because he might be my favourite character in this entire story. Roger Bacon, English friar, scholar, philosopher. Born around 1214, died around 1292, and a man who was by medieval standards magnificently, gloriously unusual. Bacon believed and argued at considerable length and with considerable passion that human aging was not simply the inevitable operation of nature. He believed it was largely caused by poor habits, by bad food, by exposure to corrupting air, by moral failures that weakened the body's vital spirit. And therefore, and this is where it gets wonderful, he believed it could be slowed. Bacon wrote a work called De Retardatione Accidentium Senectutis, which translates roughly as On the Retardation of the Effects of Old Age. In it, he laid out a program for extending healthy life through careful diet, specific remedies, and right living. Some of his recommendations were reasonable by any standard: eat moderately, breathe clean air, avoid excess in all things, maintain cheerfulness of spirit. Some were more characteristically medieval. He recommended the breathing of the breath of a young virgin as a restorative for elderly men. The idea being that youth was a quality that could be transferred through proximity and inhalation. I will leave you to form your own opinion about that one. But here is what I think is genuinely important about Roger Bacon's strange remedies and all. He was asking a question that was radical for his time. What if aging is not simply fate? What if the deterioration of the body is at least in part something we can influence? That question, which seems obvious and almost mundane to us today, was not obvious at all in the 13th century. In a world dominated by the understanding that all things were in God's hands, that the span of a human life was divinely ordained, that accepting suffering was a form of spiritual virtue, suggesting that you could actively work to extend your healthy years, was a quietly revolutionary act. Bacon got in trouble for it, by the way. He spent time under something resembling house arrest, accused by his own Franciscan order of suspicious novelties. Being too curious was its own kind of danger in the medieval world, but he kept writing. And his questions kept circling back to the same place. How do we make the years we have better? How do we preserve for as long as possible the capacity to think and feel and engage with the world around us? 800 years later, those questions have entire research institutes dedicated to them. Bacon would have found that deeply satisfying, I think. What I find most moving about all of this, about the humours and Avicenna and the warm baths and even the toothworm remedies from the Leech Book of Bald, is what it reveals about human nature when it confronts its own fragility. Medieval people did not simply accept physical decline and wait patiently for it to be over. They theorized, they experimented, they wrote manuals, they consulted physicians. They paid considerable sums for treatments that often did not work and sometimes made things worse, because the alternative, doing nothing, surrendering entirely to the ache and the fog and the slow fading, felt unbearable. That impulse is not medieval. That impulse is human. But here is the thing about growing old in the medieval world that the medical texts alone cannot capture. Because medicine, medieval or modern, addresses the body, it does not fully address the question of what your life means once the body begins to fail. It does not answer the question of where you will live, who will care for you, what your place in the community will be when your physical usefulness diminishes. Those questions about security, about dignity, about belonging were answered differently in the medieval world, depending on something that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with an accident of birth. Whether you were a king or a peasant changed everything about how you aged. And the difference between those two experiences, between the castle and the cottage, between power and vulnerability, is one of the sharpest, most illuminating contrasts in all of medieval history. Pull your blanket a little closer. Because what I am about to tell you is something that I genuinely believe changes the way you understand everything else in this story. Everything we have talked about so far, the aching joints, the failing eyes, the medieval physicians with their warm baths and their wine prescriptions, all of that was happening inside a container. A vast, invisible, all-encompassing container that shaped how every single medieval person experienced their life, their aging, and the approach of their death. That container was faith. And I do not mean faith in the vague, personal, spiritually inclined sense that we might use the word today. I mean something far more total, far more architectural, the kind of faith that did not sit in one corner of your life on Sunday mornings. It was the walls, the floor, the ceiling, and the air of every single day you lived. To understand what it was like to grow old in medieval Europe, you have to understand what it meant to grow old inside that world. Because for the vast majority of medieval people, the most important question about aging was not how long they would live. It was where they would go when they died. Let me set the scene properly because I think it matters. Imagine a village church in England sometime around the year 1300. It is small. Most village churches were built of stone that has already been standing for 100 years and will stand for 500 more. Inside, the walls are not bare. They are painted. Floor to ceiling, every surface that could hold a brush holds an image. Saints performing miracles, angels in golden ranks, the torments of the damned rendered in vivid, unsettling detail, figures writhing in flame demons, with inventive expressions of satisfaction sinners catalogued by their particular failures and receiving their particular consequences. This was not decoration in the way we think of decoration. This was instruction. This was the entire moral and cosmological universe of medieval life painted on the walls of the building, where you came every single week, where you were baptized, where you would eventually be buried. And at the center of all of it, the organizing principle around which everything else arranged itself was judgment. The last judgment. The moment after death when your soul would be weighed, examined, and assigned its eternal destination. Heaven or hell, salvation or damnation. The stakes were not temporal, they were infinite. Now hold that image in your mind, and then ask yourself, what does it feel like to grow old when that is the framework you're living inside? For a medieval person approaching old age, the thinning of the years between themselves and death was not primarily a medical or a social question. It was a spiritual emergency. The Church had a very specific and very detailed theology of what needed to happen before a person could die in a state of grace, and it involved several things that required active participation, active preparation, and ideally the assistance of a priest. Confession. The formal acknowledgement of your sins to a priest who had the sacramental authority to grant absolution. In medieval theology, an unconfessed mortal sin, one of the serious ones, was sufficient to send a soul directly to hell, regardless of everything else they had done in their life. This was not a minor administrative technicality. This was existential. For an elderly person who could feel death approaching, confession was not an occasional practice. It became almost an obsession. Medieval pastoral manuals, guides written for parish priests on how to care for their congregations, specifically addressed the need to visit the elderly and the sick regularly to hear their confessions, to make sure that when death came, it did not find them spiritually unprepared. There are records from medieval dioceses across England and France showing that priests were explicitly required to visit parishioners who were ill or very old on a regular basis. The Church understood that if you died without confession, without last rites, without the final sacrament of extreme unction, what we today call the anointing of the sick, your soul was in serious danger. And so the elderly, in a very real sense, lived under a kind of spiritual time pressure that we do not have an equivalent for today. Every day was another day closer to the moment of judgment. Every unresolved argument, every old resentment, every past wrong that had never been properly addressed, all of it mattered. All of it needed to be dealt with. I find this deeply affecting, honestly, not because the theology is one I personally hold, but because of what it meant for the quality of human relationships in old age. The pressure to make things right before you died, the urgency of reconciliation, the imperative not to leave things unsaid. There is something in that, I think, that we have lost something of. We tend to assume we have time. We put off the difficult conversations. We let old wounds sit untouched. Medieval people living inside that theological framework were under constant gentle and sometimes not so gentle pressure to resolve things, because you genuinely did not know when the priest would next be needed. But here is where the story gets complicated in the most human way possible. The Church's official position on aging was nuanced and sometimes contradictory. On one hand, the Church taught that the suffering of old age, the physical pain, the loss of capacity, the proximity of death was spiritually valuable. Suffering properly accepted could purify the soul. It could pay off what theologians called the temporal punishment due to sin, the spiritual debt that remained even after confession and absolution. An old person who accepted their physical decline with patience and faith was in theological terms doing something actively good for their eternal prospects. There is a phrase that appears in medieval spiritual writing again and again, offering up your suffering. The idea that pain, when consciously dedicated to God, became a form of prayer, a currency of the spirit. On the other hand, and this is the tension I find endlessly interesting, the Church also taught that old age was a gift, a sign of divine favour. Long life was evidence of God's particular mercy, a blessing granted to the righteous. The Book of Psalms, which medieval Christians knew essentially by heart, says plainly that the days of our years are 70 years. To reach that age was to receive what God had promised, so old age was simultaneously suffering to be endured and blessing to be celebrated. A spiritual gauntlet and a sign of grace, both things at once. Medieval people navigated this tension with remarkable creativity. Can I tell you about something called a chantry? A chantry was essentially a private spiritual investment. A wealthy person, typically a nobleman, or a prosperous merchant, because this required resources, would donate money, land, or property to a church or cathedral. In return, the institution would employ one or more priests whose entire job was to say masses for the soul of the donor, not once, not on a special anniversary, every single day, sometimes multiple times a day. The theological logic was connected to the doctrine of purgatory, the belief widely held in medieval Catholicism that most souls did not go directly to heaven or hell, but to an intermediate state of purification. Purgatory was not permanent, it could be shortened, and one of the most powerful ways to shorten a soul's time in purgatory was through prayer, specifically through masses said on that soul's behalf. So a wealthy person approaching old age in medieval Europe had a very concrete option available to them. You could quite literally pay for better afterlife outcomes. Not salvation itself. The Church was careful about that distinction mostly, but for a faster, less uncomfortable journey through purgatory toward the heaven that awaited. The most elaborate of these arrangements were extraordinary. King Henry V of England, who died in 1422, established a chantry in Westminster Abbey with multiple priests specifically dedicated to praying for his soul in perpetuity. The word perpetuity was meant literally, forever, or at least until the money ran out, which in the case of a royal endowment was not expected to be soon. Now I want to be careful not to be cynical about this, because cynicism misses something important. Yes, chantries were partly about spiritual insurance. Yes, there was a transactional element that makes the modern sensibility a little uncomfortable, but they were also an expression of genuine, profound terror about what came after death. These were not people going through the motions. They were people who believed completely viscerally with every fibre of their being that the soul was real, that judgment was real, that the quality of their eternal existence depended on what happened in the years and months and days before they died. And when you hold it in that light, the chantry is not a cynical purchase. It is a desperate act of love for oneself, yes, but also often for deceased family members whose souls were also being prayed for. You could buy prayers for your parents, for your children who had died young, for your spouse. It was in its own way a form of continued relationship with the dead, a refusal to let them go entirely. Here is something I want to ask you, and I am genuinely curious what you think. We live in a world where most people, at least in Western countries, no longer have that same specific theological framework. Most of us do not lie awake at night calculating how much purgatory time we have accumulated. The spiritual urgency that organized medieval old age, that constant awareness of death as a threshold leading to judgment, is not the dominant experience of aging in our time. And I wonder sometimes, has something been lost in that shift? Not the theology itself necessarily, but the urgency, the imperative to make things right, the insistence that the time you have left actually matters cosmically irrevocably in ways that cannot be deferred. I think about older people I've known who seemed completely unprepared for the approach of death, not because they lacked faith, but because our culture had somehow failed to give them any framework for thinking about it at all, as if the whole subject were impolite, as if aging and dying were something that happened to other people in other rooms out of sight. Medieval people did not have that luxury. Death was on the walls, it was in the sermon, it was in the church calendar, in the liturgy and the stories told around the fire at night. They lived with it, they planned for it, they argued with it, bargained with it, prayed at it, and when the time came, tried very hard to meet it with grace. But here is what I think is the most underappreciated dimension of the Church's relationship with medieval old age. Beyond the theology, beyond the sacraments and the chantries and the Last Judgment paintings, the Church built things, physical things, actual places where old people could live, be cared for, be fed, be sheltered from the cold and the uncertainty that the world outside so readily offered. Hospitals, almshouses, monastic infirmaries, guest houses attached to great abbeys where the elderly poor could find a bed and a meal, and the quiet comfort of prayers being said nearby. These were not luxurious places by any stretch, but they were places, and in a world where the alternative for an elderly person without family or resources was essentially nothing, the existence of these institutions built and maintained by the Church out of a theological conviction that caring for the vulnerable was a sacred obligation mattered enormously. The monastery of Cluny in Burgundy, one of the most powerful religious institutions in 11th century Europe, was distributing daily alms to hundreds of poor people, among them elderly individuals who could no longer work. This was not occasional charity. It was systematic. It was organized. It was, in the language of its time, a work of mercy, one of the 7 corporal works of mercy that the Church taught every Christian was obligated to perform: feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, clothe the naked, shelter the homeless, visit the sick, and bury the dead. The 6th one often gets overlooked, but it was taken seriously. Proper burial with prayers with a priest within consecrated ground was considered an act of profound charity for those who could not afford to arrange it themselves, and for elderly people who had outlived their families, who had no one to perform these final duties the Church provided. Not perfectly, not always, not everywhere. The history of medieval charity is not a story of seamless institutional virtue, but the framework, the theological insistence that every human soul, regardless of age or usefulness or social standing, had dignity and deserved basic care, was genuinely radical in the context of a world that did not have social security, had no pension system, and offered no safety net beyond what faith and community could provide. And that brings us naturally to the question of what happened when faith and community were not enough. Because the Church could preach the dignity of the elderly all it liked. The theology was beautiful. The hospitals existed. The almshouses stood. But if you were old and poor and without connections, if you had spent your life labouring in fields and had nothing to trade for security in your final years, the distance between the Church's ideals and the reality of your daily existence could be vast and cold and difficult to cross. The world had a system for that too, though. Not a government system, not a state programme, something older and stranger and more personal than either of those things. It was called a corrody, and it might be the most fascinating financial instrument you have never heard of. All right, let me tell you about a deal. Not a metaphorical deal, not a philosophical arrangement, an actual legally binding parchment and wax seal contract that thousands of real people signed across medieval Europe, a contract that was in every meaningful sense the world's first retirement plan, and like most financial instruments in history, it was brilliant in theory, complicated in practice, occasionally exploited by both sides, and reveals something uncomfortably honest about the human relationship between money security and the fear of dying alone. It was called a corrody, and once you understand how it worked, you will never look at a modern pension plan quite the same way again. Picture this moment. It is sometime in the early 14th century. A man, let us call him Walter, which is a perfectly good medieval name, is standing at the gates of a monastery in the English countryside. He is in his late 50s. He has spent his entire adult life working as a prosperous tenant farmer, managing enough land to feed his family and save slowly, carefully over decades a modest surplus. His children are grown. His wife died 3 winters ago. His hands still work, but they work slower now. He knows in the practical, unsentimental way that people who work with their bodies always know that the years of full capacity are behind him. The question is not whether decline is coming. The question is what he is going to do about it. And so Walter has come on a cold morning with frost still on the grass to make a deal with God's representatives on earth. He is going to buy himself a corrody. The mechanics of a corrody were elegant in their simplicity. You, the individual seeking security, would approach a monastery, an abbey, a priory, or occasionally a hospital, and you would negotiate a contract in exchange for a one-time payment in cash, or more commonly in land, or sometimes in a combination of both. The institution agreed to provide you with food, lodging, clothing, fuel for heating, and basic care for the rest of your natural life. Not for a year, not for a fixed term, for the rest of your life. However long that turned out to be, this is the detail that makes the corrody extraordinary. It was, in the language of modern finance, a lifetime annuity paying out in kind rather than in cash. You were purchasing protection against the most terrifying financial risk, that aging has always posed the possibility of outliving your resources. The monastery took on the longevity risk. If you died in 2 years, they profited handsomely. If you lived for another 30, they absorbed the cost. The deal was fixed at the moment of signing, regardless of what came after. Think about what that meant for an aging person in a world with no welfare state, no social security system, no pension fund, no savings account protected by government insurance. For someone with resources to trade a corrody was the closest thing available to a guarantee that the end of your life would not be spent in hunger and cold and helpless dependence on the charity of strangers. It was security, real, tangible, contractually binding security, and people wanted it desperately. The records that survive from English monasteries, particularly from the great northern priories like Durham, give us a remarkably detailed picture of how these arrangements actually worked in practice. At Durham Priory, historians who have studied the corrody records in depth have found that contracts held by women ran on average for 16.8 years. Contracts held by men ran for just over 10 years, which tells us 2 things simultaneously. Women in medieval England lived longer than men on average, which is consistent with patterns across history, and the monks of Durham were clearly doing at least some actuarial calculation, even without formal actuarial science. Because here is the tension that sat at the heart of every corrody negotiation. The monastery wanted to make money on the deal, or at minimum not lose money. If you were young and healthy and came with a large parcel of valuable farmland, the abbot might look at you very carefully and think this person could live another 40 years. The land is worth a great deal. But so is 40 years of daily meals and firewood. Medieval abbots, it turns out, were not unsophisticated. Studies of corrody pricing suggest that on the whole, monasteries negotiated these contracts in their own favour more often than not. Some bishops actually complained about the practice, warning that selling too many corrodies would bring financial ruin to their institutions. They were worried the monasteries were being too generous. The monasteries typically disagreed, and the record suggests the bishops were usually wrong. But let me bring this out of the ledgers and back into the human story. Because the most affecting corrody record I have ever come across is not about money at all. It is about a man named John Dale. John Dale spent 35 years of his life working as the keeper of livestock for Durham Priory. 35 years. That is not a job. That is a vocation. That is a life given to an institution spent in the fields and barns around the monastery, tending the animals that fed the community in all weather, through all seasons, from the vigour of his young adulthood into the slower, stiffer pace of his old age. And Durham Priory honoured that. In the year 1412, when John Dale was presumably well into what the medieval world would have considered his mature years, the priory made him a formal promise. When he became incapacitated by old age or infirmity, he would be given a corrody, a room, daily food, care, the guarantee that the institution he had served would not abandon him when he could no longer serve it in return. 35 years of service, and the reward was, "We will not let you fall." He was eventually admitted to the Hospital of St. Mary Magdalene, a dependency of Durham Priory, on the 18th of April 1447, 35 years after the promise was made. He had waited a long time to collect on that commitment, and his stay, the records suggest, was relatively brief. The corrody was re-granted the following year, which typically indicated the original recipient had died or come very close to it. John Dale's story is in its quiet way almost unbearably human. A man who worked his whole life for one institution, who was promised security when he could no longer work, who waited for years, kept working, kept contributing until finally the moment came when the body said enough. And then the door of the hospital opened and there was a room, and there was warmth, and there were meals, and there were prayers. He died shortly after. But he did not die alone. He did not die cold. He did not die hungry. That was the corrody at its best. And it is a best that I think deserves genuine respect. Now, because history is always more complicated than the best version of any story, let me tell you about the corrody at something other than its best. The system had vulnerabilities, and they were vulnerabilities that the powerful exploited with what I can only describe as impressive enthusiasm. The most brazen version of this exploitation came from the English crown. Medieval kings, as it turns out, discovered that monasteries with corrody arrangements were essentially sitting on a resource that could be appropriated for royal purposes. If a king wanted to reward a retired royal servant, a household official, a court administrator, a soldier who had served faithfully but did not want to pay for that reward out of the royal treasury, he could simply issue a royal writ requiring a monastery to grant that person a corrody, without negotiation, without compensation to the monastery, without the monastery's consent. Just you. You are taking this person in now. Here is the king's seal. Good day. This happened with enough frequency that it became a genuine source of complaint among monastic communities across England. There are records of abbeys and priors petitioning politely, carefully, because you did not complain too aggressively to your monarch if you valued your continued existence to be exempted from these forced corrody grants, or at minimum to receive some compensation for them. The crown occasionally listened. More often it did not, and this dynamic reveals something important about the corrody system that tends to get lost when it is discussed purely as a financial innovation. It was a financial innovation embedded in a world of power, and power in the medieval world, as in every world, had a way of bending formal arrangements toward its own convenience. The monastery's deal with Walter the aging farmer, who came to the gate with his land deed in hand, that was a genuine negotiation between more or less equal parties. The monastery's deal with the king's retired chamberlain, delivered by royal writ with no negotiation at all, that was something different. That was compulsion dressed in the language of charity. Let me ask you something that I have been sitting with for a while. When you think about retirement, your own retirement, or the retirement of people you love, what is the thing you are most afraid of? I suspect for most people, the answer is not actually poverty in the abstract. It is something more specific. It is the fear of losing control, of becoming dependent, of being in a position where you need other people to make decisions for you, where your comfort and your dignity rest in someone else's hands, and you have no guarantee that those hands will be kind. That fear is not modern, it is ancient. And the Corrody was in a very direct sense a medieval response to that fear. But here is the detail that most people miss when they look at this system from the outside. A Corrody did not just provide food and shelter. The better arrangements, the ones negotiated by people with enough resources to insist on specifics, also included provisions for what we might call quality of life. There are surviving Corrody contracts that specify not just bread and water, but the quality of the bread, white bread, rather than the coarser dark bread eaten by the monastery's poorer dependents. The type of ale, better ale, not the weakest grade. A specific daily ration of meat or fish, often at higher quantity than ordinary monastery fare. Sometimes a private room rather than shared dormitory accommodation. Sometimes a servant to assist with personal care. Sometimes a small annual allowance of cash for personal expenses. In other words, these were negotiated agreements, and the people who negotiated them were fighting within the constraints of their world for something that every human being across every century has always fought for. To be treated even in old age, even in dependence and decline, as a person who matters. The most poignant Corrody records to my mind are not the grand arrangements of wealthy donors with their elaborate specifications. They are the simpler ones. The ones where ordinary people, tradespeople, minor servants, small farmers scraped together whatever they had and brought it to the gate of a monastery and essentially said, "This is everything. Please make sure I am not abandoned." There is a document from the 13th century that describes an arrangement made between a man named Arne of Louvain, in what is now Belgium, and the person who agreed to care for him in his old age. It is not even a monastery contract in this case. It is a private arrangement with an individual caregiver. And the specifics of what Arne negotiated are almost heartbreaking in their modesty. Food, a fire, clean clothes, that is what he asked for. Food, a fire to sit by in the cold months, and clothes that were clean. He transferred his property, whatever he had managed to accumulate over a lifetime, in exchange for those three things, and the agreement included a provision: if his caregiver neglected these obligations, a court could intervene. Someone at some point made sure that Arne's dignity was protected not just by goodwill, but by law. Someone decided that an old man's right to warmth and a clean shirt was worth writing into a legal document. I find that quietly extraordinary. Now, the Corrody system was not available to everyone. Let us be clear-eyed about that. To purchase a Corrody, you needed something to purchase it with: land, money, a long record of service to an institution that felt obligated to honour it, some form of social capital in a world where social capital was everything. For those who had none of those things, the landless labourer, the widow with no surviving children, the elderly person who had simply worked and arrived at old age with nothing but a tired body, the Corrody was not an option. For those people, the options were narrower. Family, if family existed and was willing. Charity from the church, if the church's resources in their area were sufficient, or increasingly in the later medieval period, the almshouse, a communal institution usually endowed by a wealthy donor as an act of Christian charity that provided basic accommodation for a small number of the local poor. And alongside all of these formal arrangements, there was something else. Something less visible in the records, less easy to quantify, but perhaps more important than any of them. The simple, daily, unremarkable labour of families caring for their own. Because the truth of medieval old age, the thing that is sometimes lost when we focus on the institutional arrangements, the corridors, the hospitals, the church programs, is that for most elderly people, most of the time, it was their children and grandchildren and siblings and neighbours who made the difference between enduring and drowning. and the experience of being that elderly person, of watching your world shrink, of watching younger people move through life with the energy you once had, of finding yourself increasingly dependent on the people you once cared for. That experience was shaped by something more fundamental than theology or medicine or financial contracts. It was shaped by who you were, by where you were born, by whether your name was followed by the word lord or the word peasant. Because in medieval Europe, the castle and the cottage were not just different places to live, they were different universes of aging, and the gap between them in comfort, in dignity, and the quality of the years available to you at the end of your life was a chasm so wide that it is almost difficult to believe both experiences existed within the same civilization at the same time under the same god. Two men, same century, same country, same god watching over both of them. One of them is Edward I of England, king, conqueror of Wales, hammer of the Scots, that is literally what they carved on his tomb, which tells you something about how he wanted to be remembered. He is 68 years old, and he is on horseback moving north through the English countryside towards Scotland for what will be his final military campaign. His body is failing, he has dysentery, he is visibly weakened, the men around him can see it, but he is still giving orders, still commanding, still in the most fundamental sense in control of his own story until almost the very last page. The other man has no name in the historical record. He never did. He is a villain, a serf, a tide labourer on an estate in Yorkshire. He's also in his late 60s. His back has been bent by 40 years of harvest work. His hands are so damaged by decades of gripping tools in cold weather that some mornings he cannot fully open them. He has no physician. He has no physician's assistant. He has no warm castle with stone walls thick enough to hold the heat of the fire through the night. He has a one-room cottage with a thatched roof and a dirt floor, and if he cannot work tomorrow, his family's arrangement with the lord of the manor becomes precarious in ways that a king on horseback could not begin to imagine. Same civilization, same century, same faith, completely different universes, and tonight I want to sit in that gap, because I think the contrast between how the powerful and the powerless experienced old age in medieval Europe is one of the most illuminating windows into what that world actually was. Not the idealized version, not the romantic version with the beautiful manuscripts and the soaring cathedrals. The real version with all its extraordinary inequality intact. Let us start at the top. Because the top genuinely was remarkable. For a medieval king or high nobleman, old age brought a particular set of complications that were entirely unlike the complications faced by anyone below them, but also, it must be said, a set of resources for managing those complications that were equally unlike anything available to ordinary people. Take the matter of diet. We spent time earlier discussing how medieval medicine recommended warm, moist, easily digestible foods for elderly people. For a peasant, translating that medical advice into reality was nearly impossible. You ate what the harvest produced, what the season allowed, what your lord had not claimed as his portion. In a bad year you ate less of that. Variety was a luxury. Fresh meat was often a luxury. The things that medieval physicians would have considered genuinely nourishing for an aging body, good wine, white bread, tender cooked meats, fresh fish, were for most of the medieval population either rare treats or entirely out of reach. For a king, the royal kitchen was a medical institution in itself. I mean that almost literally. The great medieval households employed cooks who were expected to understand the basic principles of humoral medicine well enough to prepare food appropriate to the lord's current health and age. There are surviving records from royal and noble households that describe specific dietary adjustments made for aging lords, lighter meats, particular preparations, specific spices believed to warm and strengthen the elderly body. The kitchen was not just feeding the king, it was in the understanding of the time medicating him. And then there were the physicians, An aging king had access to the best medical minds available in his kingdom. These were men, always men at the highest levels, though we will return to women's roles shortly, who had trained at the great universities: Oxford, Paris, Bologna, Salerno, which was the oldest medical school in Europe, founded in the 9th century, and drawing on both Arabic and Latin medical traditions. These were not local herb gatherers with a rough knowledge of willow bark. They were within the limits of medieval medicine, genuinely educated, genuinely skilled at the things medieval medicine could actually help with: wound care, setting, bones, dietary management, recognizing the signs of serious illness. Edward I had royal physicians attending him throughout his later years. Henry II before him had court physicians. The great nobles of France and Germany had household medical staff as a standard feature of their establishments. Compare this to a Yorkshire serf in his 60s, whose medical care consisted of his wife's knowledge of the local herbs, the advice of the village priest, and prayer. But here is where the story of noble aging becomes genuinely complicated, and this is the part that I think most people do not expect. Having power did not necessarily mean having peace, because the thing about being old and powerful in medieval Europe is that the power itself created dangers that the powerless never had to face, specifically the danger of your own family. The medieval system of inheritance was built around the principle that power transferred at death, and when a king or a great lord began to age visibly, when his hand trembled at table, when he spent more days in bed than on horseback, when the whispers started about whether he was still truly fit to rule, the people who stood to inherit began to do a very particular kind of mathematics. History is full of medieval lords whose aging was complicated, shall we say, by the impatience of their heirs. Henry II of England, one of the most capable rulers medieval England ever produced, spent the last years of his life in a state of bitter, exhausting conflict with his own sons. His sons rebelled against him, not once, multiple times. His final years were consumed not by peaceful reflection, but by active warfare against his own children, who wanted what he had before he was finished having it. He died in the year 1189 in a castle in France, having just received a list of the rebels who had joined his son Richard's latest uprising against him. Near the top of that list was the name of his youngest son John, the child he had loved best, the one he had tried hardest to protect. The betrayal by most accounts destroyed whatever will to live he had left. He was 56 years old, exhausted, heartbroken, and he had spent the final years of his extraordinary reign fighting not enemies from outside his family but the people he had raised. Power did not protect Henry II from grief. It created a particular kind of grief that only power makes possible. Now let us come down from the castle, all the way down to the village. A medieval peasant's old age was shaped by one overriding, inescapable reality: the body was the only asset, and when the body failed, the asset was gone. This is not a metaphor. In a feudal system built on agricultural labour, your value to the community and to the lord who controlled your land was almost entirely physical. You ploughed, you planted, you harvested, you tended animals, you maintained the hedges and cleared the ditches and did every other form of physical work that kept a medieval estate functioning. And in return you had the right to farm a portion of the land for yourself. When you could no longer do the work, the calculus changed. There was no formal retirement age. There was no moment where someone officially released you from your obligations. What happened typically was a gradual negotiation, a slow, sometimes painful process of transferring responsibility from the aging parent to the adult children. You did less. They did more. The farm's management shifted from your hands to theirs, and if you were lucky, if your children were willing and your relationship with them was intact, this transition happened with something resembling grace and mutual care. But luck, as we have established, was not evenly distributed. There are records from medieval English manorial courts, and these are actual legal documents, not literary accounts, that show elderly peasants bringing complaints against their own children. Children who had taken over the farm and then quietly reduced the food they brought to the aging parent. Children who had taken possession of the cottage and relocated the elderly parent to a smaller outbuilding. Children who had in the most explicit terms failed to uphold the informal agreements that were supposed to govern this transfer of property and responsibility. The fact that these cases appeared in manorial court records at all tells us something important. It tells us that the community recognized these obligations as real, that there was a social expectation enforced when necessary by legal proceedings that adult children were responsible for their aging parents. It also tells us that the expectation was not always met, and when it was not met, an elderly peasant had very limited recourse. Go to the manor court as some did, rely on neighbours, rely on whatever church charity was available in their area, or simply endure. Let me give you a number that I think is worth sitting with for a moment. Bioarchaeologists who study medieval skeletal remains examining the bones of people who actually lived and worked and aged in this period have found consistent measurable differences in the physical condition of remains from different social classes. The bones of elderly labourers show significantly more severe osteoarthritis than the bones of elderly individuals from higher social classes. The wear patterns are different. The damage is different. The evidence of repeated physical stress over decades, the kind of stress that accumulates when your entire life involves heavy, repetitive manual work in all weather conditions, is written directly into the skeleton. Your social class in medieval Europe did not just shape how you lived, it shaped how your body aged. The inequality between castle and cottage was not just a social fact, it was a biological one. It showed up in the bones, and this was true not just in degree but in kind. A nobleman's arthritis, if he had it, was managed with warm baths, physician oversight, dietary adjustment, and the ability to rest when needed. A peasant's arthritis was managed by continuing to work anyway because the alternative was not eating. I want to be careful not to romanticize the peasant experience by treating it as simply noble suffering. It was not noble, it was often just hard, relentlessly, exhaustingly, invisibly hard. The kind of hardness that leaves no dramatic record, no great rebellion, no famous last words, just the quiet arithmetic of lives spent entirely in labour and ending in the same. But here is something that complicates the picture in a way I find genuinely interesting, and this is the part I always want to make sure does not get lost. Medieval peasants were not simply victims of their circumstances, they were agents within them, limited agents constrained at every turn by poverty and law and geography, but agents nonetheless. The village community was a real social structure with real mutual obligations. Neighbours helped neighbours in ways that were partly charitable and partly self-interested, because everyone knew that the wheel of fortune, as the medieval painters had it, turned for everyone. The family that helped an elderly widow with her firewood this winter might need help themselves in 10 years. There is evidence in manorial records and in archaeological studies of medieval villages of what historians call community care networks, informal systems of mutual aid that provided at least partial support for elderly and infirm villagers who had no family to fall back on. It was not systematic, it was not reliable, but it existed. And for some people it made the difference. And there is something else worth saying about the peasant experience of old age that tends to be overlooked. In a world where physical labour was so central to identity and value, there were forms of respect available to elderly peasants that did not depend on continued physical strength. The accumulated knowledge of an experienced farmer, knowing which fields drained well, which crops grew in which soil, when to plant and when to wait, based on a lifetime of observation, that knowledge was genuinely valuable, irreplaceable in fact. We will return to this idea in considerable depth later tonight because it opens into one of the most fascinating aspects of the entire medieval experience of aging. But for now, just let it sit there, that even in a world that valued the body above almost everything else, there were forms of old age that carried their own quiet authority. What strikes me most when I look at this entire landscape, from the royal physician to the dirt floor cottage, from the chantry endowments to the manorial court complaints, is how clearly it reveals a truth that is uncomfortable precisely because it is so persistent. The experience of aging has always been shaped by inequality, not just in the medieval world. Always. The resources available to you when your body slows down, when your capacity diminishes, when you become dependent, those resources have always been distributed according to the same basic logic that distributed everything else. Power, birth, luck. The particular shape of your life up to that point. Medieval Europe just made this truth unusually visible, unusually stark. The castle and the cottage stood within sight of each other. The contrast could not be ignored, could not be papered over with the language of equal opportunity or the fiction of a level playing field. In the medieval world, the field was demonstrably, obviously, architecturally unequal, which makes the cases where elderly people found dignity and security despite that inequality, the Johns Dale of Durham, the widows of the almshouses, the old farmers whose neighbours brought them firewood, all the more remarkable, all the more worth remembering. And yet, for all the inequality between men of different classes, there was one axis of medieval life along which the inequality ran even deeper, even more consequentially. An axis that shaped every single thing we've talked about so far: the medical treatment you received, the legal protections available to you, the property you could hold, the choices you could make about your own old age. That axis was gender. Being a woman in medieval Europe meant navigating a world that had very specific ideas about your value, your role, your legal status, and your place in the social order. And when you add the dimension of aging to that already complicated picture, something remarkable happens. Something that I genuinely did not expect when I first started looking into this, because the story of how women aged in medieval Europe is not simply a story of additional disadvantage layered on top of existing disadvantage. It is something stranger, something more contradictory, something that begins in genuine vulnerability and moves in certain specific circumstances toward a kind of freedom and authority that surprised even me. Let me tell you about a woman named Christine de Pizan. She was born in Venice in 1364, grew up at the French royal court where her father served as an astrologer and physician, married at 15, had 3 children, and then when she was 25 years old her husband died of a sudden illness. Just like that. One season he was there, the next he was gone. And Christine de Pizan, 25 years old with 3 children and an elderly mother depending on her, found herself facing the medieval world entirely alone. What she did next was by any measure astonishing. She became a writer, a professional writer, one of the first women in European history to support herself entirely through her pen. She wrote poetry, history, political philosophy, and eventually in 1405 a remarkable book called The Book of the City of Ladies, a defense of women's intelligence, virtue and capacity that reads across the distance of 600 years with startling directness and warmth. She lived into her 60s, possibly her early 70s. She outlived most of her contemporaries. She spent her final years in a convent not because she had lost her independence, but by choice in the quiet that followed a life of extraordinary output. Christine de Pizan is not a story about the typical medieval woman's experience of aging. She was exceptional in almost every way, but she is a useful beginning because her story contains all the central tensions of what it meant to be a woman growing older in medieval Europe. The vulnerability of widowhood, the surprising freedoms that vulnerability sometimes unlocked, and the fundamental question of what happened to a woman's identity and authority as she moved through the later stages of a life that the world had never quite designed with her full participation in mind. We need to start with the basic legal architecture because without it nothing else makes sense. In medieval Europe, a woman's legal status was largely determined by her relationship to men. As a daughter, she was under her father's authority. As a wife, she passed under her husband's authority, a legal concept in English common law called coverture, which held that upon marriage a woman's legal identity was essentially absorbed into her husband's. She could not own property independently. She could not sign contracts. She could not bring lawsuits in her own name. In the eyes of the law, she and her husband were one person, and that person was him. This arrangement had implications for aging that were not immediately obvious, but were, when you looked at them, quite profound. Because here is the paradox at the heart of medieval women's legal existence. The moment her husband died, all of that changed. A widow, particularly a widow of property but to varying degrees, a widow at any social level underwent a legal transformation that was genuinely remarkable for the time. She became, in the technical language of medieval law, a femme sole, a woman alone, and that status paradoxically gave her more legal autonomy than she had possessed at any previous point in her life. She could own property, she could manage estates, she could sign contracts, she could appear in court, she could make her own decisions about where to live, how to spend her resources, whether to remarry or not. Widowhood was in the medieval legal system the closest thing available to female independence, which creates this genuinely strange situation where the event that was emotionally and practically often devastating, the loss of a husband, the disruption of an entire household social order, was also legally speaking the moment of greatest freedom in many medieval women's lives. I find that deeply uncomfortably interesting. And I think it tells us something important about how systems designed around one set of assumptions create unintended consequences when life does not cooperate with those assumptions. Now, the experience of widowhood in medieval Europe varied enormously, depending on exactly where you stood in the social hierarchy. For a noblewoman, widowhood could mean real and substantial power. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most famous women of the entire medieval period, is the obvious example, but she is almost too famous to be useful as a case study. Her life was exceptional in ways that make generalizing from it difficult. More instructive, perhaps, is the pattern that historians have documented among the lesser nobility and the prosperous merchant class, the widows who managed estates in the absence of adult heirs, who ran businesses, who negotiated with tenants and suppliers, and legal representatives who made decisions about their children's marriages and their own households, with an authority that their married sisters simply did not possess. There are records from medieval English towns showing widows taking over their deceased husbands' trades, continuing craft businesses, merchant enterprises, brewing operations. The guild records of medieval London show widows of guild members being admitted to the guild in their own right, permitted to continue the trade, to take apprentices, to function as full economic actors in ways that had been closed to them while their husbands lived. Old age for these women was not a narrowing. It was in certain respects an opening, but let me give you the number that I think puts all of this in sharpest focus. At the Hospital of Sainte-Avoye in Paris, founded in the year 1283 by a wealthy widow named Marguerite de Provins in partnership with a parish official, the institution was specifically designed to shelter elderly widows, not the general poor, not orphans or pilgrims or the sick in general, specifically women over the age of 50 who had been widowed and had no means of supporting themselves. Up to 40 women at a time could live there. They received food, lodging, clothing, and the spiritual comfort of regular religious services. Marguerite de Provins herself, a widow, had looked at the landscape of her city and identified a specific underserved category of vulnerable people, older women alone, and built an institution to address precisely that need. This is not a general act of charity. This is a targeted response to a recognized social problem, which means that by the late 13th century, at least in a city as sophisticated as Paris, there was sufficient awareness of the particular vulnerability of elderly widows to justify building an institution specifically for them. The vulnerability was real. Elderly widows, especially those without surviving children, or those whose children were unwilling or unable to provide support, were among the most economically precarious members of medieval urban society. They fell through the gaps of every other system. They were not the widows of great lords with the states to manage. They were not young enough to remarry easily. They were not connected to monasteries or guilds or other institutional structures that might provide a safety net. They were in many cases simply old women alone, and in medieval Europe, as in most historical periods, that was a genuinely dangerous thing to be. There is something I want to explore here that most history books treat only briefly, but that I think deserves more careful attention. Because running alongside the legal and economic story of medieval women aging, there was a cultural story, a set of ideas, some reverent, some fearful, some spectacularly contradictory about what an old woman was and what she represented. Medieval culture had a complicated relationship with older women. On one hand, the church idealized the figure of the wise elder, the experienced mother, the grandmother rich in knowledge and faith, the woman whose long life had given her a depth of understanding that younger people should seek out and respect. This was the positive archetype, the wise woman, the experienced counselor, the keeper of family memory and domestic knowledge. On the other hand, and this is where it gets uncomfortable, medieval culture also had a persistent, deeply rooted anxiety about older women that expressed itself in ways ranging from unkind to genuinely dangerous. The anxiety centered on a few specific things. First, the body. Medieval aesthetics valued youth, and the aging female body was often portrayed in art and literature as something to be pitied or even feared. There is a whole tradition of medieval writing about the vetula, the old woman that is not kind. These are satirical texts mostly written by men that depict elderly women as vain, about their lost beauty, lustful in undignified ways, physically repulsive. The misogyny is not subtle. It is not trying to be subtle. But here is the thing I find genuinely fascinating about this tradition. The women it was describing did not disappear or become invisible. In fact, in many communities, elderly women held a very specific and quite powerful social role, precisely because of their age and experience. They were the midwives, the healers, the keepers of domestic medical knowledge, the women who knew which herbs helped with fever, which preparations eased childbirth, which remedies had been passed from mother to daughter through generations of practical trial and experience. This knowledge was not nothing. In a world where trained physicians were expensive, rare outside urban centres, and primarily serving wealthy male patients, the practical medical knowledge of elderly women in their communities was often the only medical resource available to most people. It was used constantly. It was relied upon. It was passed down with great care. And it was at the same time increasingly looked upon with suspicion by the ecclesiastical authorities who were trying to consolidate control over medical practice. I want to be careful here because this is a topic where popular history tends to oversimplify in ways that distort the actual picture. The Great Witch Trial, panics of European history, the ones that resulted in mass accusations, mass trials, and mass executions, those happened primarily in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. They are not primarily a medieval phenomenon in the way that people often assume, but the anxiety about older women and their knowledge, the suspicion that certain kinds of female wisdom crossed a line into something dangerous and perhaps diabolical, that anxiety has roots in the medieval